Okay, imagine you're a teacher. You've been trained to get up in front of a classroom and instruct them. You're used to getting physical feedback, their expressions, their droopy eyelids, this sort of thing. Now you're told that process needs to transition remote, just for 2 weeks, although actually it's going to be 2 years. In addition to the obvious challenges in this journey, our guests Nadya and Jennifer today also bump into supply chain issues, as they taught digital fabrication courses remotely. In this interview, we explore what digital fabrication is and some of the challenges and successes coming out of moving their courses remote.
My name's Jennifer Jacobs. I am an assistant professor of media arts and technology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I run a research lab called the Expressive Computation Lab that's split between media arts and technology and computer science at UCSB.
My name is Nadya Peak. I'm also an assistant professor. I'm at the University of Washington in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering, where I run the lab Machine Agency, where we focus on the precision of machines and the creativity of people.
And how did you first both become acquainted with each other?
We were both grad students at MIT.
Nadya was originally one of the first people who started introducing me to digital fabrication. I was a student in a course taught by her advisor, Neil Gershenfeld, that she was a TA for. So I think we first connected when you were teaching me how to implement stepper motor drivers.
Well, for listeners who don't know, I imagine a lot of people with titles like data scientists can get pretty far on just dealing with virtual things and not physical things. Could you share maybe some overall themes about what goes on in fabrication and what some of the opportunities are?
Generally, my group focuses a lot in the space of digital fabrication, which you can kind of think about very broadly as using machine code to control automated tools for making physical objects. So a lot of people focus on digital fabrication around technologies like 3D printers, but it's actually a field that expands to a lot of different workflows and processes for making things like laser cutters, computer-controlled cutting machines, but even a pen plotter can be considered digital fabrication. I focus on a specific area of digital fabrication that I frame as computational fabrication, which is kind of the combination of computational design or using computer programming to design geometry and other digital designs, and then using digital fabrication to turn those designs into physical objects. So it's a way of transforming code to physical artifacts, quite literally. And our lab does a lot of work in different areas of computational fabrication. Right now, we're really focused on the intersection of ceramics production and computational fabrication. So we're using code to design objects for being 3D printed in clay. So you can get lots of really cool, intricate 3D vessels that would be difficult to make by hand.
Building on that, I would say historically, fabrication meant the making of stuff, which could be done by hand, shaping clay or carving wood. And then increasingly, tools become a useful way to more precisely and more repeatably make stuff. And as those tools became controlled by computers, the way that we used to make multiples of things were you made a mold, for example, or you had a template that you followed. And now, instead of doing that, you can create shapes in code, which allows you to make multiples, but it also gives you the possibility of having infinite variation without necessarily the same sunk cost that you would have if you were making a mold or a template or some other tool to help you make the object. And so Jennifer and I are both interested in, well, what does that mean for how we engage with making stuff? What does that mean for how we might control these machines, or how we might program them? Just because variation is possible doesn't necessarily mean that every variation that you make might work. And so both of us are focused a lot on the intersection between what can you imagine virtually versus what can you actually do physically.
Well, my own sort of biased evaluation of things is that the field is sort of at the early adoption phase. There's a large growth curve ahead of us, perhaps. Maybe eventually everyone will have a 3D printer or something like that in their house. I guess technically they could today, but we don't. Is there any sort of like Moore's Law we could apply here, or any way of looking what the progress is? How do you both look at the evolution of the field?
I think you have to think about, when you think about Moore's law, it applies to computers, right? So there, it's exponential growth from the perspective of a CPU. And in this case, you're not really specifying who it is that is experiencing this exponential growth. You're just implying that it is a person, maybe a person with machines in their house. And that, I think, is a much more critical thing to consider. Where is this happening and why? Maybe in the 20th century, the way that things were fabricated or manufactured happened in small workshops, or there were small businesses. A lot of things were custom made. In the 20th century, the rise of mass manufacturing changed that a lot to have these places become centralized and optimized and much more efficient, allowing us to have inexpensive products that were nevertheless very complex. And so when you say, is it going to be the case that we have fabrication in every home, you're implying a decentralization again. And that means that it has different implications for what we're looking for. We're not necessarily, if you have a 3D printer in your home, efficiency might not be the most important thing. It might have much more to do with design intent or what you might want to make and how you might go about making those things. And so I think it's important to think of, when you're thinking about scaling, where is this scaling happening? And I think Jennifer and I both think that the scaling happens where people are already making stuff, but might want to make things in different ways or for different applications or for a so-called long tail.
A lot of the adoption we've seen with digital fabrication outside of industrial contexts doesn't necessarily fit kind of models of people who are on the cutting edge of tech enthusiasm and tech adoption, but also is really structured around people who, as Nadya mentioned, already have an interest and investment in making things. One of the tensions that is specific to wider scale digital fabrication adoption relates to technologies for designing for these tools, both just kind of general thresholds for learning and just labor that are required to use CAD, for example, to design for a 3D printer, but also challenges around the domain specificity or availability of domain-specific design technologies for digital fabrication. So much of what we see right now is really drawing from the ways in which people have been designing for digital fabrication in an industrial context for like the past 50 years or more. We're still really only starting to see some variety in supporting different approaches for expressive design in different domains for digital fabrication.
Well, for people who are interested in getting into digital fabrication, there's some skill set they want to develop. I know you'd mentioned programming as a part of that, so getting like a plain vanilla CS degree certainly wouldn't hurt. That'd be a good help, but it's maybe not the exact holistic skill set you need to get directly into digital fab. What are the academic opportunities like? What should someone be studying, and what are the pieces of that education to get into the field?
I really don't think you need a CS degree to be in fab.
Yeah, I would say I teach students from art, design, and CS backgrounds, and I would actually argue that for much of the skill set required for digital fabrication, having experience in some form of physical construction or making is much more important.
Much more important. The big problem with CS people is they think they can undo everything. But once you crash your machine, it's over. You don't get like another one. I mean, I guess you could buy another one. But there's a computer science professor, Eric Demain, who I at some point was showing how to use like a 5-axis motion stage. And he apparently plays a lot of video games. And immediately grabbed the joystick, which is, I guess, like a joystick that you might control a video game with, and traveled at high velocity towards the X-ray emitter. And I was like, listen, I don't want berylliosis. You don't want berylliosis. Like, just go a lot slower, please, and don't crash into the beryllium window. Thank you. So I think that being attuned to physical things is an important thing. But obviously, to do digital fabrication, you start from digital design. So a big part of what you might do is learn digital design tools like Rhino or Blender or SolidWorks or Onshape. And I think that kids these days learn those things already starting in elementary or middle school. There's like SolidWorks app for kids where they're doing CAD before they really know object permanence. So yeah, I think that maybe that's a place to start.
Conversely, I teach a digital fabrication course for CS students at UCSB, but I see the benefits of that course as less being about helping students to further their programming skills and more being about a new and powerful context to consider the applications of computer programming that's very different from what a lot of people associate with programming as a tool to create interactive digital objects with different behaviors. There are very different but very significant constraints that come into play when you are writing code to shape the design of things that will have to be physically realized. So I more see it as an opportunity to deepen and enrich CS education as opposed to CS education as being a necessary component of learning and applying digital fabrication in a powerful way.
I think it also requires you to really apply a lot of the skills that aren't emphasized necessarily, at least in undergraduate CS education, that have much more to do with dealing with the hot mess of production code that's out there and all of the file formats and all of the ways in which you can introduce different bugs, all of which exist. I don't know, they're completely pervasive in digital fabrication equipment, because unlike an iPhone or a computer, there's not a ton of users of all of these things, and bugs don't necessarily get fixed. And so if all of your arcs are turning out as straight lines, you're just going to have to figure out how to deal with that in your file formatting rather than, trying to wait for someone to fix it for you. And so I think it's also a lot about, if you're doing complex digital fabrication and you're pushing the limits of what maybe have been represented in the past in digital models. A lot of it has to do much more with software wrangling and tool chains and getting your data pipeline set up well, as opposed to being really good at making efficient algorithms or optimizing your code.
Well, prior to the pandemic, what were some of the ways you could teach digital fabrication in the classroom?
Prior to the pandemic, the idea would have been that we would have taught in on-campus makerspaces, so spaces where people have access to digital fabrication equipment. Now, some of the equipment that you might use now, like a 3D printer, is available for, you could get a 3D printer now for less than $200. But some of the other equipment that you might want to use, like a water jet cutter or laser cutter, those things can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so it's useful to have a shared space where people have shared access to those kinds of tools. And so we teach in those types of spaces, hands-on access to the tools that you might use to make stuff.
Yeah, and in addition to the fact that digital fabrication equipment can range in costs, often a lot of it requires not just significant expenditure to acquire, but also specialized facilities to support. So if you're going to run a laser cutter, although laser cutters can be relatively affordable, you also need access to external ventilation to manage it. So a lot of these technologies are not things that can be installed easily in a person's home.
It seems to me there are, some disciplines like abstract mathematics where you probably can do just well remote. There's really nothing that has to be physical or you have to be there to see the chalkboard or not. Maybe at the other extreme, we could say like playing a wind instrument. I don't think you could study it from a book for many years and then pick it up and be a virtuoso. You have to use the instrument. Where do you see digital fabrication on that? Can I kind of study things from the book and get pretty far, or do I really have to be learning hands-on?
I think opinions differ on this, but I think Jennifer and I are both very much on the side of there's a lot of things that happen when you actually go from code to physical object. And so in our teaching, we really emphasize hands-on experiences and doing things hands-on. And so, I don't know, I guess this is what we're going to get into in the podcast, but we had a bunch of different things that we did to try to create those experiences in a remote context.
It can vary, but in general, I would say that Nadya and my philosophy is the sooner you can get to interacting with the actual machine, the more informed decisions you're going to be making on the design and computation phases of the work. This can vary. Generally, if someone is going to be using, like high-speed CNC machine where the risk for damage to the machine is great. If you are incorrectly programming it, you spend a lot of time in advance training people on how to properly create designs for and create machine code for those machines. But for a lot of digital fabrication equipment, you can get to it relatively quickly with little training in advance. And we try to stress that.
Thanks to our sponsor, Neptune.ai. 99% of machine learning teams are doing really awesome things at a reasonable scale with maybe 4 people and 2 models, not necessarily 100 people and 1,000 models. Yet most of the industry best practices come from the handful of companies operating models at hyperscale. The folks at Neptune.ai want to change that by sharing insights, tool stacks, and real-life stories from the practitioners doing machine learning and ML ops on the toughest challenges, distilling their findings for everyone. They even built a flexible tool for experiment tracking and model registry that will fit with your workflow at no scale, reasonable scale, and beyond. Check them out at neptune.ai. Thanks to our sponsor, Red Sentry. Nation-states, militaries, and governments have some of the most powerful offensive security tools around. At the same time, underground hacking groups have become structured, funded, and highly sophisticated organizations. Because of this, your company is facing an uphill battle on multiple fronts, and no one wants to be the next ransomware victim or headline in the news. Red Sentry set out to solve this problem with a unique twist on pen testing and vulnerability scanning. Basically, they find your vulnerabilities before the bad guys do, and tell your security team how to fix it. They were founded by a penetration tester who hacked Fortune 500 companies and decided to create a more powerful offensive security tool. This became the Red Sentry platform, a 24/7 365 scanner that you can combine with their traditional pen testing for year-round protection. With one of the easiest onboarding processes I've seen, you can start protecting your company in under 5 minutes. It takes a modern approach to fight modern hackers, and Red Sentry was built for that. To see why so many companies are changing the way they do pen testing, go to redsentry.com/skeptic for a free scan today. That's redsentry, SENTRY.com/skeptic. So you've got courses on the books, students are signed up, then unexpectedly the pandemic hits. What are some of the first immediate challenges for transitioning the coursework online?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest questions was initially, are we still going to teach our classes? So it's just something that up front, although makerspace resources vary, access to equipment varies, this was sort of unprecedented in the context of trying to teach a lab class with physical equipment completely remotely and from students' homes and from our own homes. So
I think also the thing that was really difficult about it in the beginning was we didn't know it was going to be remote the whole time, Like the first communication that we got at the University of Washington was, we're going to be remote for 2 weeks. And here we are 2+ years later. We're still not totally back to normal. And so it was also this every week, maybe we're going to go back, maybe we're not. Like, what is the best way for us to approach this? And so are we going to teach our classes, and how much effort are we going to put into creating a remote experience when it's uncertain when we might be back in the workshop?
And there's, the obvious question is, when are we going to be back in the workshop, and when are we going to have access to fabrication equipment again? But there are all these secondary but equally critical challenges that come out of that. Like, what does machine support, maintenance, and debugging look like if we're not in person with the students, if our TAs are not in person with the students? How do we engage in evaluation of student outputs when there are things that we don't actually physically have access to? And so it wasn't just the loss of access to equipment, but all of the supplementary context, that community that comes together around that equipment. That was something we were trying to grapple with, and not just us, many people were trying to grapple with.
But at the time, we were very energetic and we really wanted the best outcomes for our students. And so we decided to get all of them 3D printers.
Well, you decided. I called Nadya and I said, what are you going to do? And she says, I'm thinking about buying 3D printers. And then I thought, that's a great idea. I should do that too. So Nadya gets full credit there.
Well, it's very generous.
But yeah, so, when Jennifer and I were graduate students, 3D printers were, I think, $30,000, $35,000. Like, there were some things coming on the market, maybe MakerBot and stuff, that were getting less expensive, but those were still like $3,000, $5,000, and they were really crappy at the time. And now you could buy 3D printers that would ship within days for less than $200. And so we thought, this sounds like at least a way to preserve some of the hands-on experiences that we rely on when teaching this material.
So when a student gets that package in the mail, can they set it up and is it ready to go? Or is this more of a journeyman apprenticeship situation where they really need to observe it in operation?
No, I mean, another thing that's new is YouTube. The amount of support there is for 3D printing in general, because it is such a extremely well-adopted hobbyist practice, is really extensive. And so, we also provided a lot of support in terms of how do you assemble the printer and like how do you first do initial calibrations. But you'll find thousands of videos of people using the same 3D printer on YouTube maker channels and going through calibration and optimization processes for making the print output better. So it's not just us that they rely on for support.
To give you some context, when we first bought the printers, the specific ones we bought were the Ender 3 Pros, which is a variation on a popular open source design. They come as a kit of parts, so it takes, depending on your skill, between an hour to 2 hours of assembly. Maybe I can probably do it in 30 minutes now for the printer to be assembled and operational. Then there's additional work that needs to be done to actually adjust it and tune it so that it's calibrated, printing accurately. And that's something you need to continue to maintain over the course of using it. That's putting aside all of the knowledge required around selecting filament, printing material, and also using CAD tools and CAM tools to design and create sliced geometry that the printer can actually execute. So we started with students assembling and tuning their printers and then started introducing them to designing for them. But definitely those two elements were interspersed throughout the entire class, as they would be in a standard class.
I think the first time we taught the classes too, or I have taught them remotely twice now. The first time we taught them, I think we also benefited to some extent from the students just being wildly enthusiastic about doing anything that wasn't just staring at a screen. And so maybe it sounds kind of annoying to have to assemble and maintain a piece of equipment, but I at least found that with the students in my class that it was just a really welcome opportunity in contrast to everything else that was going on at the time.
Well, with access to a lab, you've got sort of the ideal conditions. Students' at-home settings are going to vary from, how much space they have access to, all sorts of situations like that. Could you outline any of the challenges you saw in students adopting to this, if there were any, and getting things set up for the at-home use case?
Well, students, are often very space constrained. They're in one room that is their bedroom and their office and also maybe their dining room, and 3D printers are not super loud, not in comparison to a milling machine or something, but they're not totally silent. And a print job, maybe a quick print job could take you 20 minutes, but a lot of the stuff that they were doing for their homework assignments were 6, 10, 12, 15-hour prints. So you really saw a big difference in people who had access to more space and therefore just like more opportunity to run the printer all the time and experiment, versus others who were more space constrained and had to work around limitations of shared space and also maybe not wanting to run a piece of equipment unattended in a space that was shared with cats or small children.
Yeah, so I had a student whose cat chewed through some of the cables on the printer. She had to resolder them together. I had students mention, and Nadya and I both did weekly check-ins with our students, mention that they had trouble sleeping because they ran a print overnight, which are, I think, important because they were somewhat minor inconveniences in some cases, but definitely things that would not be feasible for people in all contexts. So I tried to think more carefully going forward about what this meant for accessibility and how this would impact people's personal living spaces. Another major challenge, both for the students and for Nadya and I, was material access. So we not only had to get students printers, we had to make sure that they had material to print with those printers. For whatever reason, at the start of the class, there was actually a lot of limitations in access to 3D printing filament. I suspect in part because people were printing face shields with it, but I don't know entirely. So we just had students who sometimes didn't have filament. We had cases where students were working with really different filaments or different types, and we were diagnosing problems with different materials. I also had a case where a student's filament was just performing really strangely, and we finally figured out it was because she had let it sit in the sun for like a week outside of her apartment when it was shipped to her, and it had become brittle as a result of that. These were, forms of labor that are present to some degree in an in-person workshop, but were really exacerbated in the remote context. And much of my time was spent just dealing with the logistics of supply chains to my students.
Yeah, I at some point went to everyone's house to bring them materials because none of my students had actually gone out of Washington. They were all still somewhere in Washington. And that is when I learned that I would be a terrible Amazon delivery driver. I apparently am very bad at understanding if 2271 is a smaller or bigger number than 2275.
I think one of the interesting things about this, although it was very stressful at the time, is these are not issues that only existed because of our class during the pandemic. They just started to impact us in new ways. But there are lots of people who could potentially benefit from or participate in digital fabrication that experience access to both support and materials and supplies. So people working in rural areas, for example, people who, like, we can see a lot of variance in your ability to be successful with 3D printer and your ability to try lots of different things out, which directly correlates with the amount of money you can spend on materials and parts. And so none of this is necessarily new. It was just impacting us in a new way.
Yeah, also, besides just like material implications, a big important part of being able to use this at all, or being able to use this model of hobbyist 3D printers in lieu of full workshop, relied on Jennifer and I's insight into how do different actions on this machine, which is small and inexpensive and maybe works in particular ways, how do those relate to what you might encounter on an industrial scale? Or now that we're only doing additive fabrication and there's no subtractive processes that the students are encountering, how do we still tailor the kinds of assignments that we have for fabrication tasks such that they're still learning things that you might only encounter otherwise if you were engaging in subtractive fabrication as opposed to additive?
I think you could probably capture maybe more in the closed workshop and setting where you have the makerspace set up in ideal ways, but remote learning's there, it worked to a certain degree. Can we quantify that in any way? Is there a loss that occurs by going remote, or can we get some equivalence out of it? Is there a way to measure this?
I don't know. You could be very concrete about it and be like, they made really small stuff in comparison to what they normally make.
If that's your metric, sure.
I think it's difficult. It's just looking more broadly at the learning impacts of the pandemic. I think we're still grappling with what was gained, what opportunities emerged, but also really what was lost. And I don't feel confident to speak at that. That's just going to take quite some time to unpack, but there were losses. Some of this we tried to get at by looking at what some of our colleagues and other people who teach digital fabrication or other forms of physical making did during the pandemic. So we're not at the point where we can generalize about the detriments that the pandemic had to forms of learning that required previously access to in-person facilities and hands-on making, but we interviewed colleagues who also taught these kinds of courses and used a variety of strategies. And while there were really important benefits, and I'd love to talk about that, we saw some evidence that some of the general trends relating to distance learning, particularly impacting people who were already underserved and under-resourced, having the most vulnerable students be hit the hardest, was also present in classes around digital fabrication. So students who weren't already deeply engaged with the subject matter, with a peer community, were maybe less likely to be supported in remote fabrication classes. Students who had less access to resources were not able to engage in the same types of prototyping as students with more access to resources. And this is also true for institutions. So we were really fortunate to be able to speak with faculty at Stanford who, kind of following the first quarter of the pandemic, ended up purchasing the same 3D printers we purchased for our students for a large proportion of the engineering student population, which is wonderful and amazing to see. But that's something that's simply not feasible at schools that don't have the resources like an institution like Stanford.
Having run these courses now and had acquired, I guess, some longitudinal data on it, do you have any advice for other educators like yourself about how to be successful in doing remote learning specifically with digital fab?
I think I would say that the under $200 3D printer, if you can afford them, if you can get administration support to get those out to students, I was actually really impressed at what a powerful learning platform that can be. There are unique learning opportunities that come from having personal access to fabrication, and these printers are reliable enough and high quality enough that you can really leverage a lot of different types of opportunities. So just the direct access to something that works well, we noticed that students were able to create a lot more variations in their designs than they would even in a in-person class, because they had their own machine and they could, if they wanted to, use it 24/7. And the technology holds up now, which is great. It might not have been true 5 years ago, 10 years ago, a decade ago. I also, for people who are working in the context of computer science and computing, there are really rich opportunities for using digital fabrication machines as platforms for engaging and exploring machine control, programming machine behavior. We did an exercise where students actually had to generate their own G code from a computer program as opposed to using a slicer. G code is basically the language that gives the machine instructions on what actions to perform. And that was an incredibly rich opportunity for students because they were able to make designs that wouldn't be possible with slicer software, CAM software that had been developed by third parties. And that's something that would be really hard to do in a shared makerspace context where you generally don't want to be running somewhat questionable machine code on a $10,000 piece of equipment. There's lots of opportunities there. They require financial support to leverage, and they require additional labor on the part of the instructor and facilitators to make use of, but they are there. So if you have the support, then it's such a great opportunity.
There are a lot of challenges, and a lot of those challenges can be solved with money, but not all of them. And one of the real opportunities that we saw had a lot to do with, I think, things that Jennifer and I research in general that have to do with maintenance and calibration of the expectation of what happens when you bridge the digital to physical divide. What happens when you go from code to object, and what does the machine context do for that? And how can you do machine maintenance and different kinds of calibration such that your objects are meeting the expectation that you have from your data?
We're going to have links to the paper in the show notes so listeners can follow up, but would both of you mind sharing anywhere else that listeners could follow you online?
Yeah, all of my work from my research group is at my lab's website, ecl.mat.ucsb.edu. Most of my work is done by my amazing grad students, so they're all well represented there, worth checking out.
Our lab website is deps.washington.edu/machines, and we're machine_agency on Twitter.
We'll have links to all of the above in the show notes. Jennifer and Nadya, thank you both so much for coming on Data Skeptic.
Totally. Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
That concludes another installment of Physically Distributed. Thanks to our sponsors, Neptune.ai and Red Sentry. Myself, Claudia Armbruster, as associate producer. Vanessa Bly, guest coordinator. Show notes written by David Abembe. And our host, Kyle Polich.